the discussion. We will be focusing with Aimee on how to concretely implement a systemic approach to policymaking by using what we call the well-being lens. The well-being lens is a practitioner's guide to help us move from the buzzword of system thinking towards actually implementing it for better policies. We see a lot of potential in this. The well-being lens has mainly 4 steps. Think in systems, that is, see systems rather than parts, move from the analytical thinking that William mentioned towards system thinking. Understand the functioning and the dynamics of the system that we are aiming to change. Today we will focus on the transport and urban systems. The 3rd step is to get a sense on how systems change, so differently how transitions take place, and what are the policies that can help us accelerate desirable transitions. Then the 4th step is to implement these policies to concretely build a new system that can provide us with better results, better functionalities than the current ones. I will be focusing on steps 1 and 2, and Aimee will focus on steps 3 and 4. Let's start with the first. Before going into more detail, I would like to actually hear from you, to know what you put behind the term thinking systems or systems thinking. And I have 2 questions in a poll that, Elodie, please, if you could share with participants. This poll is anonymous, and we will look at the results together in a few seconds. So let's just take a few seconds to respond, please. So far, I have 20% of participants. Let's wait a few more seconds so that more people get to respond. I'm at 39%. Again, the polls are anonymous. We will maybe stop when we reach 70%, Elodie. Maybe 5 more seconds and we will close the poll. Super, so you should be able to view the results. So on the first question about what is system thinking about, most of you chose the second option about understanding why systems produce the result that we observe. A few of us also selected the first and the third option. And if I wanted to start with this question, is because this is something that actually confused me for a while. I had the impression that a systemic approach was about analyzing everything at the same time, and this is a kind of a confusion that I wanted to present at the beginning, to say that a systemic analysis is not necessarily about understanding everything at the same time. That is very difficult and actually impossible in complex systems. We can and must focus on specific problems. In the paper we did, we looked mainly at emissions in the transport and urban systems. What changes in a systemic approach is our perception, our perspective on how to solve the problems. I will get into more detail on that. Let's have a look at the second question. You can scroll down to see the responses. So I see that most of you see potential in system thinking, which is great, and I really hope then that this presentation will be of interest for you, and I hope as well for the people that are not sure or do not think so. I hope that you change a little bit your mind after this presentation. So let me continue. I will stop sharing the results. System thinking is basically around focusing on systems as wholes rather than on specific parts. System thinking sees the forest rather than focusing solely on the tree. And this is, as William mentioned, this is very different to what we are used doing. We are taught that if we have a complex problem, we can divide it in small parts and analyze each part in isolation. That is analytical thinking. And analytical thinking does not work very well in complex systems. This is because a key insight of system thinking and of complexity science, which is the science that studies how complex systems work, is that in complex systems, the results that we observe emerge from the system structure rather than from the properties of its parts. For example, emissions are a result from the systems. In the transport sector, traffic lights, cars, bikes, or you and me, we are the elements or the parts of the system. The structure is about how these elements are arranged. For example, in the transport sector, who gets to use which part of the street, where pedestrian can cross, those are all parts of the system structure. When we divide complex problems into small parts, what happens is that we miss the structure. And that is problematic for policymaking because in complex systems, the potential for change is in the system structure. So we are taught to divide problems rather than seeing systems as wholes, and that can be problematic for complex systems. We are also used to this, a linear approach to problem solving. If I do A, then B happens. The issue is that the systems we are dealing with, of course, look much more like this. They are non-linear, they are complex. And there are huge opportunities in these non-linearities that we will be discussing about. So based on these insights, policies from a well-being lens focus on redesigning systems so that they are structured to maximize well-being outcomes, which is what we ultimately would like to maximize, right? This is why we call it the well-being lens. Let me move to the second step. So once we see the potential of thinking in systems and know a little bit more about how complex systems work, we can start applying that thinking to understand the functioning, the internal dynamics of the system we're trying to change. Trends are particularly useful for doing that. We observe, for example, that emissions from transport sectors have increased with a decrease after the 2008 crisis. We also see that as income increases, vehicle ownership increases also. We are used to looking at trends, and most of us are very good at looking at trends. We ask, however, less often the question on why these trends. How would you explain, for example, this is a question for you, how would you explain that as income increases, vehicle ownership increases? What would you give as a response? Why is that? If you could just reflect for a few seconds on this question. One potential response could be that when income increases and people can afford a car, they choose to buy one. Car ownership increases because of people's preferences to which policies need to adapt. There is, however, an implicit assumption in that response, which is that people's preferences are independent or exogenous from the transport system they are embedded in. A key insight of system thinking is that that is not the case. It is that people's preferences are not independent or exogenous from the system they are embedded in. I am not saying with this that there is not a part of individual choice. There always is. But individual choice alone does not explain people's behavior. You may, for example, prefer that your kid does not ride a bike if the street to his or her school looks like this. I was actually unable to find a photo with a street like that and a kid in a bike, because most people would prefer that their kid doesn't ride a bike in this context. You may, however, be happy if your kid rides a bike when you're on holiday in the countryside. You are the same person, but the context, the system, and in this case, the safety considerations change, and thus your preference changed. With a systemic approach, we try to understand what is the system structure or dynamics driving the trends that we observe, the preference, for example. We have in the paper used a tool to help us with that, which is called systems dynamics. And this is how John Sterman from MIT describes the tool. I'll let you maybe read his quote. So by using this tool, we found 3 dynamics at the source of high emissions and vehicle use in transport and urban systems. These dynamics are induced demand, urban sprawl, and the erosion of alternative transportation modes. I will briefly describe each of them, and I will then pass the floor to Aimé, who will tell you more about how policies can change these dynamics that, as you will see, do not lead to the best results we could hope for. Induced demand. This is a very well-known dynamics in transport analysis since the 90s. And it refers to the phenomenon by which investments in road expansion, aiming to reduce congestion and travel time, end up having the opposite effect. This is because the more investment there are, then the more roads there are, which increases car attractiveness, which encourages more people to choose the car as their means of transportation, which then increases congestion and emissions again. This dynamic is a clear example of people's preferences determined by the system structure and by policy decisions. Preferences on where to live are not exogenous either, which takes me to the second dynamic, which is urban sprawl. As road capacity expands, people can now move farther away from the city and still get there within a reasonable time, for example, 30 minutes by car. Urban sprawl, when the places of interest stay in the center, in the city, increases the daily distances traveled, and it also increases car dependency, mainly for 2 reasons. Active modes, such as bikes or walking, are no longer an option. You may know if you live in the suburbs. As distances get longer and you get the highway as the only way to get to places, you simply cannot use active modes for your daily commute. Public transportation is also less of an option. It becomes less feasible to get a good frequency, good service, and not that expensive fares as density decreases. Here it is important to highlight something that Simon mentioned in the introduction, which is that moving to the suburbs can be a choice. It is likely the choice for the people with these houses in the photo, but it is also a necessity for a lot of people as housing prices in cities increase. So lower income households moving to suburbs and become dependent on the car. And this, let's say, gives rise to a number of equity considerations in terms of access to opportunities, but it also significantly limits the scope of climate policies, such as carbon prices. Imagine that high carbon prices may not be an acceptable option for low-income households for which the car is their only means of transportation to get to their jobs. Now, these 2 dynamics, induced demand and urban sprawl, lead to the erosion then of alternative modes, as we just saw, active transportation and public shared transportation. These dynamics are in a way creating the opposite conditions that what we need for effective and ambitious climate policies. They are increasing car attractiveness and dependency, and they are at the same time reducing the attractiveness of sustainable transport modes, which we need for people to be able to choose differently. Let's say that the bad news of our analysis is that transport systems as they are today are very difficult to decarbonize, at least at the pace and scale needed. The system's energy, let's say, is taking us towards the opposite direction to the one we need to go. There are good news, however, and the good news is that we can change these dynamics. We have designed these systems through decades of policies, not necessarily intentionally, but we can change these dynamics if policy decisions are focused on changing them. And that is what Aimee will tell you more about. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and let me now share my screen with all of you. So I want to start this part of the presentation with talking about mental models, because mental models influence to a great extent what we see, but also what we don't see. And a crucial idea behind our mental models has been that increasing mobility or physical movement and speed are the means to improving well-being. Thus, our current systems are structured precisely to do that, to increase mobility and prioritize speed. But do we need to travel further and faster to increase our quality of life? Actually, if we take a closer look at mobility, we see that this can grow when people, for instance, have limited access by walking and thus have to drive long distances. And this can be hindering their well-being in addition to increasing emissions. So what we argue in the paper is that systems would need to deliver accessibility or easy access to places of interest, whether a jobs or a friend's house or the grocery store. As shown in the diagram, accessibility is the combination of proximity and mobility. Thus, focusing on mobility not only targets a derived rather than a real demand, but also denies the role of proximity. And we call this the proximity blind spot. And we argue that this is at the core of the dynamics behind car dependency that Mariana was talking about, because it makes invisible the trade-offs between space used for delivering mobility and the space needed for placing things we want to get to. So the result is, for instance, high, arguably excessive shares of public space being allocated to a space-intensive means of transport, such as a car, or development that is far and cheap, that is facilitated or at least not hindered, because the way in which these actions narrow the possibility of creating proximity is not seen at all as a problem. So the limitation with what we call decoupling strategies is that these remain proximity blind. It means that they do not shift us away from car dependency. Decoupling strategies focus on doing precisely that, decoupling high and growing mobility from emissions, taking for granted that growing mobility is a given, the result of people's preferences, and even more so, the result of a thriving economy. As such, the emphasis is then placed on technologies, in other words, in replacing the part of the system that is seen as a problem, which is the combustion car. And as such, the role of reducing mobility through, for example, avoiding unnecessary trips and long distances and shifting trips to more sustainable modes then remains marginal at most, because the structural changes needed to trigger large effects are not made. So this is problematic because it traps the climate effort in a system that is pushing in the opposite direction. We're aiming on the one hand at rapidly decarbonizing mobility, but these efforts are being importantly offset all the time by the production of more mobility. And so, as a number of modeling exercises show, these strategies are unlikely to be sufficient to move at the pace we need to move. If we were to use, for example, our diets as an analogy, these decoupling strategies would be like keeping our sugar-based diet and then doing some sport. And they also keep the system being a system of large fleets, which needs to be also recognized because it implies high material and resource demand, which also increases the challenges. Even when resources could be found, high material and resource demand imply important trade-offs that we are creating with wider environmental goals, such as issues of water pollution and loss of local ecosystems that come from mining for resources for batteries for electric vehicles. In addition, as Mariana said, these decoupling strategies are not desirable because they are also based in the idea of keeping the same system, which is not only a high mobility system, but also a poor, limited, and unequal accessibility system that is also causing a number of other benefits to well-being, including health. So we really need the climate strategies that can actively help us to shift away from this unhealthy transport system that the proximity blind spot has locked us into. This implies that policies need to aim at creating the balance between proximity and mobility that would allow that the majority of trips are short distance and through sustainable modes, and people then only move up the ladder of less sustainable modes as they move to less frequent trips. But how can we go about generating the needed change and building this new system? Well, we argue that adopting well-being climate strategies can really help us for that. Well-being strategies are centered really on redesigning transport and urban systems to deliver high accessibility and low emissions, including by untapping the mitigation potential of reducing mobility, but restoring proximity. Importantly, they will imply radical changes in policy priorities because the policies that tackle each of the dynamics behind car dependency need to become central. Technology and pricing instruments will remain important elements, but these need to be targeted at accelerating the system's redesign rather than trying to offset emissions of existing systems. So I'll now go and provide the main leverage points that we found in terms of policies to shift us away from each of these dynamics. And I will illustrate the first one of these with the following video, which I will let you watch. Okay, so as some of you might have guessed, what this video tries to illustrate is that it is possible to go from induced demand to the very opposite dynamics, that of disappearing traffic. And to do these, well-being strategies make the redesign and reallocation of streets and road space a priority of climate action. They propose approaches based on complete streets, which aim at safely balancing space between different range of users and activities, and placemaking, which recognizes that streets have a function as a link, but also as a place. They also acknowledge the importance of parking policy and the potential of road charging schemes that allow to shift away from building more roads as a response to congestion, but acknowledge also that these should be used, placing as the main aim to achieve an efficient use of space to promote enhanced accessibility for all and not only for motorists. It is important to recognize how the COVID-19 crisis has provided us with an excellent option to test and to see that reallocating road space has indeed very rapid effects in many cases. For instance, analysis in a number of cities show that new biking infrastructure has increased cycling in between 11 and 48%. And for instance, in the case of Paris, 6 out of 10 users of pop-up bike lanes are new cyclists. Also, this redesign of road space is so powerful because it allows to benefit from the proximity that is already in place. So in many cases, yes, we need to restore proximity and especially walking proximity. But there are some cases where we do have cycling or micro-mobility distance proximity, which is, for example, the case in many suburbs of many people and their distance to commuting trains. But having safe and dedicated infrastructure is key to unlocking this potential. A well-being strategy also places the redesign of territories at the core of climate strategies to go from sprawl to compact development that creates proximity. Among other things, well-being strategies propose the integration of accessibility criteria into the core of land use decision-making, which also calls for transport authorities having an increased role. So importantly, these can build from street design, which I just mentioned, as this liberates space and also integrates different urban functions already, such as local businesses or green areas in the space that is renewed. So in a way, this is already changing city structure, and so it can give a lot of synergies for moving forward. But also things that we are doing anyway and that we have plans for, such as new development or urban renewal, or the way we're putting in parking, pricing, and allocation. This is having a huge impact in the territories of tomorrow, and we could be doing it very differently. Improving governance would also be at the center of the agenda for a well-being lens type of strategy, because we need to transform territories as wholes and not only parts of them. And for example, metropolitan transport authorities and metropolitan bodies in general could be very instrumental to advance these changes. It is important to recognize that a number of frameworks are available, such as the 15-minute city, which already sets as the basis of urban development accessibility thresholds. These can be built on, but we need to again rethink metropolitan regions as ecosystems of 15-minute cities, for instance. Finally, another element to trigger structural change is to acknowledge the need to rapidly counteract the erosion of sustainable transport alternatives. As such, well-being strategies propose actions to strengthen public transport networks, but also to build on new business models and technologies so that the new services, and especially sustainable and shared services that can be provided now, could help rapidly expand the network of feeder services. As I said, innovation is still an important part, and even the improvement of the parts of the system, so the vehicle technologies. But strategies need to tap on the potential for emissions reductions that systemic innovation can bring, because this is where the real synergies lay. And for this is crucial that policies and incentives to accelerate the shift towards EVs do not foster car dependency by making free parking or waiving tolls as part of incentives, for instance, and also ensuring that the charging infrastructure that we're rolling out is really equipped and an enabler of this multimodal, sustainable, and shared system that we want to create. Carbon pricing that we know solely will only provide incremental change, as Simon mentioned, can also be more effective and acceptable if accompanying structural changes in the system. So to finalize, I will address 3 of the most relevant concerns that we hear when talking about well-being strategies, which is that these are too difficult to implement, that it will take too long, and that car dependency is too hard to reverse because that would mean going against people preferring cars. Because one of the aims of our paper is also to show that well-being strategies are not necessarily more difficult, that there are a number of synergies which I've talked about and low-hanging fruit for us to benefit from, but they do call for systems innovation in the wider sense. So for innovation in governance, in communication, in participation. We see, for example, tactical urbanism being very effective in many places. Also, they will not take longer. Actually, redesigning system provides a better prospect to what we're doing, which is the shift towards EVs, but also it will allow to really get to the comprehensive strategy that we need to make sure that transport contributes to achieve the low demand system that can put us in a better position to get early mitigation and an early mitigation pathway, reducing the need for carbon dioxide removal technologies at the end of the century and increasing certainty of reaching our goals. So finally, while sometimes not obvious at first sight, going against car dependency is actually not about reducing, but rather increasing choices and shifting away from a system that imposes high cost and the need to incur in lots of trade-offs in our daily lives between better transport and better housing, for instance. It is about understanding that today's preferences are not absolutes, but rather preferences given the current system, which is not designed for providing sustainable and quality accessibility by design. Thus, in the overall well-being strategies, really try to go beyond this optimization of parts and have the ambition to build better systems for better lives. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much.